That night, everything was too perfect to be true. The lights in the hall shone like captured stars on candelabras, and voices mingled in an excited buzz of pride and congratulations. I was the center of attention, the kind of attention that came with expectations as heavy as my grandmother's dining room's marble table. Stand up straight, Alyssa. A Milano always maintains impeccable posture. My grandmother's voice, sharp as a knife's edge, sliced through the hall before I could even sit down. Oh, my grandmother Mia. If there was a rule book called How to Be Perfect, she wouldn't just have written it, she would have underlined every word with gold ink. But that night, something inside me felt stronger. Maybe it was the proximity of graduation, or maybe I was tired of being treated like a porcelain family statue. Smiling at my reflection with a spark of rebellion in my eyes, I took a deep breath. Today, I thought. I expected it to be just another typical event. Fake compliments, hidden rivalries, my grandmother trying to put everyone in their place. And of course, Paul, the big secret of my life, sending funny messages to keep me sane as I navigated the minefield that was my family. But there was something in the air that night. It was like the wind before a storm, that feeling that something was about to change, even if you didn't know exactly what. There I was, mechanically smiling as guests surrounded me, their words of admiration swirling like ocean waves. And then I saw him, Paul, on the other side of the hall. His eyes met mine, and it was as if the entire world faded away. He smiled, and I felt my heart fill with courage. Now or never. Grabbing a champagne glass with more determination than elegance, I walked to the center of the room. My father watched me with curiosity, my mother with concern, and my grandmother, well, she was busy criticizing someone else's dress. Excuse me, my voice echoed through the hall. The sound of conversations faded, and all eyes turned to me. I could feel my heart beating in time with the war drum. I just wanted to take this special moment to share something important. Something that means a lot to me. My grandmother raised an eyebrow, and I knew she was about to open her mouth, but I didn't give her the chance. I'm engaged. The silence that followed was heavier than the gold chain my grandmother wore around her neck. My father choked on his champagne, my mother widened her eyes, and my grandmother, well, I had never seen someone look simultaneously horrified and furious. What are you talking about, Alyssa? Her voice was like the distant roar of thunder. But I continued. I'm engaged to Paul, I announced, holding my chin high as if my courage were a shield against the withering gazes around me. And that's when the storm truly began. My grandmother Mia didn't hesitate for a second. She swept through the hall like a warship slicing through the sea, her heels echoing like gunshots on the marble. When she stopped in front of me, her expression seemed sculpted from pure ice. Paul. She repeated the name as if it were a forbidden word. Paul Lyrie. The entire hall held its breath. It was as if everyone there was watching a live play, the plot thickening with every passing minute. Yes, Grandma. Paul Lyrie, I confirmed, holding my gaze firm on hers, though my voice trembled slightly. For a moment I thought she would explode right there. But my grandmother was more sophisticated than that. Instead of shouting, she smiled. A cold smile, the kind you give when you've already planned how to destroy something without even raising your voice. Interesting, she said, her voice low but venomous. You've chosen to ally yourself with that family. The same family that tried to ruin our reputation for decades. A Milano engaged to a Lyrie. Frankly, Alyssa, I thought you had more sense. She turned away, but not before giving my parents a quick glance, as if expecting them to intervene. My mother looked ready to speak, but my father held her arm. He knew trying to confront me at that moment was like poking a lion with a stick. I didn't choose to ally myself with anyone, I said, with a strength that surprised even myself. I chose Paul because I love him. Because he sees me for who I am, not for a surname. That was the moment I realized I had crossed an invisible line. My grandmother's smile vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous. Utter disdain. Love is a fantasy, Alyssa, she replied, cold as the night. And fantasies don't sustain a family. They don't maintain prestige. They don't guarantee the future. My throat was dry, but I couldn't back down. Perhaps that's why the past still haunts this family, Grandma. Because no one here cares about what truly matters, the people. A murmur spread through the hall. It was as if I had opened a window and let the wind of truth into a place where it hadn't been welcome for years. That's when she did it. You want to talk about the past, Alyssa? Do you really? Her voice rose and silence returned to dominate the room. She turned to the guests, her arms raised as if she were about to tell a tragic story to an eager audience. Well, I will tell. There's something everyone here should know. Something you don't understand, my dear granddaughter. My heart quickened. What was she going to say? What secret was she about to reveal? That fiancé of hers, that Paul, she continued, her voice laden with drama, is the grandson of the woman who tried to destroy our family. Haley Lyrie, a woman who lied, cheated, and betrayed to get her fortune. And now she wants to take something more from me. The room erupted in murmurs. Her words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everyone who heard them. That's ridiculous, I retorted, my voice louder than I expected. Paul isn't like his grandmother. He's a good, honest person. And he loves me, which is already more than I can say about the way this family acts. My grandmother stood motionless, her eyes narrowed as if calculating her next move. The hall seemed caught between two worlds, the weight of the past and the struggle for the future. If you choose to go forward with this, she said slowly, each word laced with threat, then know that you are choosing to leave this family behind. Those words fell like thunder. For a moment, no one moved. My heart pounded so fast it seemed to echo throughout the entire hall. And then something inside me clicked. Maybe it was the weight of years of being molded like a pawn in a game I never wanted to play. Or maybe it was Paul's gaze across the room, filled with love and support. Then I choose, I declared, my voice clear as the sound of shattering glass. I choose to be who I am. And if that means leaving this family behind, so be it. My grandmother stared at me for a long moment. A deadly silence filled the room, but I didn't flinch. Not this time. What happened next seemed like a strange dream, or perhaps a nightmare. My grandmother stood there, motionless, staring at me as if I had just committed the greatest sacrilege in Milano history. But it wasn't her gaze that shook me. It was the silence. That oppressive silence, laden with unspoken judgments, broken expectations, and the promise of consequences yet to come. She finally turned, slowly and deliberately, leaving the room with the same impeccable posture she had always demanded of me. The crowd parted for her as if they feared being struck by the lightning of her wrath. Well, that was unexpected. I heard someone murmur in the background, but I didn't pay attention. My parents stood near the dining table, and their expressions spoke volumes. My mother looked torn between rushing to comfort me and chasing after my grandmother. My father, on the other hand, just shook his head, a weary look on his face. I knew I had done something big, something no one had ever dared to do in that family. I had broken the rules. More than that, I had ripped up the rule book. Before anyone could say a word, I felt a warm hand touch mine. It was Paul. He had crossed the hall, ignoring the stares, the whispers, and the palpable hostility. When our eyes met, everything around me seemed to shrink. I'm here, he said simply, and for the first time that night I felt I could breathe. But the relief was short-lived. My mother approached, her expression a mixture of concern and urgency. Alyssa, she began, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone was listening. You know what you've done, don't you? This will change everything. I know, Mom, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, even as the pressure of years of expectations began to weigh on my shoulders. She'll try to hurt you, Alyssa, my mother continued, lowering her voice. And not just emotionally. You know what your grandmother is capable of. Paul squeezed my hand. She won't be alone, he said, looking at my mother with a determination I had never seen before. My mother hesitated. For a moment, she looked like she was about to say something more, but then my father put a hand on her shoulder. Leave her, Rosalie, he said, his tone calm but firm. She's already made her choice. And he was right. I had made my choice. Now, all that remained was to face the consequences. In the days that followed, the repercussions of that night began to surface. Unreturned phone calls, absolute silence from my grandmother, and of course, the first news stories starting to circulate in Albany's social circles. It wasn't just a scandal, it was the scandal. And I was ready, or at least that's what I told myself. The following days were a mix of tense calm and unexpected storms. It was as if the world around me was holding its breath, waiting to see what my grandmother would do. And then she did. It all started with an unexpected phone call from my mother. It was early, the kind of hour when even the sun hesitates to peek out from under the covers. I answered with a yawn, still half asleep. "Alyssa," my mother began, her voice laced with a nervousness that made me sit up in bed immediately. "Your grandmother. She's gone too far this time." "Of course she has," I replied, rubbing my eyes. "That's not news. She's called a lawyer." The words hit me like a bucket of ice water. "A lawyer?" My mother sighed on the other end of the line. "She's trying to disinherit you, Alyssa. And not only that, she wants to ensure that if you continue with Paul, you won't receive anything. Not a penny. Nothing associated with the Milano name." For a moment I was speechless. Not that money or possessions mattered that much to me, but there was something in her gesture, something so calculated, so cruel, that hurt more than any slap could. "She thinks she can control me like this," I murmured, more to myself than to my mother, as if I were here only to fulfill her whims. "Alyssa, are you sure you want to continue with this?" my mother asked, her voice filled with fear. "She'll do anything in her power to bring you down. You know that." "Yes, Mom," I replied with more conviction than I felt. "I know." When I hung up, I looked out the window of the small apartment Paul and I shared. It was modest, but it was ours. It was a choice I had made without anyone pulling the strings for me. But in that moment, looking at the gray sky, I wondered if I was ready for what was to come. Paul, of course, was calm, as always. When I told him, he simply nodded, a half smile on his face. "She can't control you, Alyssa," he said, pulling me into a hug. "Not anymore." And as comforting as his words were, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Because my grandmother wasn't just a stubborn woman. She was a force of nature, the kind of person who moves mountains to get what she wants. The next day brought another surprise, this time in the form of a text message. It was from an unknown number, but the message was unmistakably hers. "You will always have a place here, Alyssa. But you need to make the right choices. There is still time to correct your mistake." I read the words several times, each one colder and more calculated than the last. But instead of anger, I felt something different. Freedom. Because in that moment, I realized that the only thing she could take from me was something I never truly wanted. "Correct my mistake?" I murmured, typing my response firmly. "I haven't made any mistakes. And I'm not going back." The message was sent, and with it, a part of me that had always craved her approval finally vanished. My response was a direct hit, and I knew she wouldn't let it go. It didn't take long for the storm to begin. The next morning, Paul woke me up with a worried look. "Did you see this?" he asked, handing me my phone with the screen already lit up. There it was, an article gleaming on Albany's most read gossip page. The headline looked like something out of a courtroom movie. "Rebellion in the Milano Dynasty. Heiress rejects family tradition." I read it silently, my breath growing heavier with each line. The article was a disguised attack disguised as journalistic curiosity, full of insinuations that I was destroying the legacy of the family, and that my relationship with Paul was a blow against the traditional values of the Milanos. "This is her work," I murmured, returning the phone to Paul. "Of course it is," he replied without hesitation. "And it's also a desperate attempt to embarrass you. She's losing control, Alyssa. That means you're winning." I wanted to believe him, but the weight of being publicly attacked crushed me. For years, I had been trained to be perfect, to maintain the family's impeccable reputation. Now, that reputation was being used against me as a weapon. And that's when my mother appeared at our door. She was dressed simply, without the expensive adornments she usually wore at family events. But what struck me most was her look. There was no judgment, no disappointment, only concern. "May I come in?" she asked gently. Paul nodded and left us alone. As soon as he left, my mother sat on the sofa, nervously running her hand through her hair. "I knew she would do this," she began, looking at me with tear-filled eyes. "I knew, but I didn't think it would go this far. She just wants to destroy me, Mom," I replied, my voice harsher than intended. "She thinks she's protecting you," my mother retorted, her tone bitter. "But she's wrong. She's always been wrong. I just wanted you to know I'm on your side." Those words surprised me. For so long, my mother had been a passive figure in the shadow of my grandmother. Now there she was trying to break free. "Thank you, Mom," I murmured, not knowing what else to say. She sighed and took my hand. "Alyssa, I lived under her rules too. I know what it's like to feel trapped. But you are braver than I ever was. You're doing what I never had the courage to do. Just, please be careful. She won't stop until she gets what she wants." I nodded, feeling a wave of relief and sadness at the same time. My mother was with me, but the price of my freedom seemed to increase every day. When she left, Paul returned and found me still sitting on the sofa, staring into the void. He approached, sitting beside me. "How are you?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," I lied, but he knew it wasn't true. He took my hand and squeezed it gently. "Alyssa, no matter what happens, we'll get through this together. Your grandmother may have the money, the power, the influence, but she'll never have you. And that's what bothers her most." I looked at him, feeling a small spark of hope grow in my chest. He was right. All she was doing was a desperate attempt to keep me under control. And for the first time, I realized I was winning this battle. The siege was tightening, but I was beginning to understand a liberating truth. My grandmother's control only worked if I allowed it. And now I no longer allowed it. Still, things became more complicated when I received a formal letter from the family lawyer. It was as if the paper carried the weight of the entire Milan legacy, cold and impersonal, but with a clear message. My grandmother was officially severing financial ties with me. "If this is your final decision," the letter stated at the end, "face the consequences." Paul read it with me, his eyes narrowing with each line. When he finished, he shook his head and let the letter fall onto the table. "Is that all she has?" he asked. "Money? Power? Those things may be important to her, but they don't define you, Alyssa." I wanted to agree, but a small knot formed in my throat. As much as I had made my choice, being rejected like that hurt. It wasn't about the money or the status. It was about what it symbolized. Her refusal to accept me for who I was. But I knew I couldn't give in. Not now. In the following days, my grandmother intensified her attempts. She wasn't satisfied with just disinheriting me. She began spreading even more malicious rumors, involving not only me but also Paul and his family. It was as if she was willing to destroy everything around her, as long as I returned to the place she believed I belonged. My mother called me more often than usual, trying to mediate the situation. She spoke as if she were caught between two worlds. Loyalty to her mother and a desire to protect her daughter. "Alyssa, please understand," she said in one of the calls. "Your grandmother doesn't know how to deal with loss. For her, you're not just rebelling. You're betraying her legacy. You know what that means to her." "And what does it mean to me, Mom?" I asked, trying not to sound as bitter as I felt. "I'm not her legacy. I'm a person." My mother fell silent. And in that silence, I realized that she was as trapped as I had once been. But not Paul. He refused to be swayed. And he reminded me of this every day. "You don't need her," he'd say whenever I doubted myself. "You don't need her approval, her money, or her control. You have something far more important. Freedom." And he was right. I had something my grandmother would never have, something she didn't understand. And as difficult as it was to face the storm she had created, I knew I was closer to calm than ever. The true calm only began to emerge when, finally, the storm reached its peak. It was like a hurricane that, after devastating everything around it, had nowhere else to go. My grandmother, with all her calculated tactics, her lawyers, her rumors, had used every tool in her arsenal to bend me. And when she realized I wouldn't yield, she did something I never expected. She appeared at my apartment. Paul opened the door, and there she stood, as impeccable as ever, her wool coat perfectly aligned, and her eyes gleaming with a mixture of determination and disdain. He looked at me with a silent question, but I already knew what to do. "Leave us alone," I asked. Paul hesitated but nodded, giving me a supportive look before leaving. As soon as he closed the door, my grandmother entered as if the space were hers, her heels clicking on the floor like hammers. She looked around, assessing the place, and for a moment, I thought she would comment on the decor. But instead she got straight to the point. "Are you truly willing to throw everything away?" she asked, her voice firm, but with a hint of something I couldn't identify. Anger? Sadness? I haven't thrown anything away, Grandma, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I chose something else. Something you never gave me a chance to choose, myself. She laughed, but not with joy. It was a bitter, dry laugh. You speak as if you were building something. But what do you have here? A cramped apartment? A fiancé with no influence? A job with no prestige? I have freedom, I retorted, crossing my arms. And love. And a future I chose. And that's worth more than anything you could give me. For a moment her face remained still. Then she stepped forward, her eyes fixed on mine. Do you think it's that simple, Alyssa? Her voice lowered, filled with frustration. The world isn't a kind place. You'll need protection, resources, power. And when you're alone, when you realize all this isn't enough, you'll want to come back. And on that day, I won't be here. Her words were like knives, each sharper than the last. But instead of hurting, they awakened something within me. So that's it? I asked, my voice filled with disbelief. You'd rather lose me than accept that I'm different from you? She fell silent for a moment. And that's when I realized. All the power she had always had over me came from fear. The fear of disappointing her, of not being good enough, of losing her love. But in that moment that fear vanished. I'm sorry, Grandma, I continued, my voice now firm. But I can no longer live my life trying to please you. No matter what you say or do, I'm not going back. She stared at me, and for a moment I thought she might yield. But instead she simply turned, adjusting her coat with an elegant movement. Good luck, Alyssa, she said, her voice as cold as the winter wind. You'll need it. And then she left. I stood there for a moment, looking at the closed door, trying to absorb what had just happened. For the first time, my grandmother acknowledged that I had made my decision. And for the first time, I didn't feel fear. After my grandmother left, the apartment felt emptier than ever. It was as if she had taken all the air with her, leaving a silent and heavy void. Paul returned shortly after, looking at me cautiously. How was it? He asked, placing the keys on the table and approaching. It was definitive, I replied, trying to organize my thoughts. She made it clear that, for her, I'm no longer part of the family. Paul sat beside me on the sofa, taking my hand firmly. And how are you feeling about it? I hesitated to answer. The truth was more complicated than I wanted to admit. On the one hand, there was relief, the kind of freedom that comes only when you finally. I looked at the photo for a long moment, letting his words sink into my heart. As complicated as my story with my grandmother and my family was, I finally had something no one could take away, my own future. Years later, as I sat on the porch of our small San Antonio apartment, looking at the city lights, I realized how far I had come. Life was simple but full of purpose. I was no longer Alyssa Milano, the perfect heiress. I was just Alyssa, and that was enough. Paul opened the door, bringing 2 cups of tea. He smiled and placed one beside me, sitting in the chair next to me. Thinking about the past? He asked, already knowing the answer. A little bit, I admitted, holding the warm cup in my hands. I guess it's hard sometimes not to look back. It's still strange to think I left everything behind. Paul chuckled softly, looking at the stars. You didn't leave everything behind. You just chose what you wanted to take with you. I thought about it for a moment, letting his words settle. He was right. The parts of me that truly mattered, my strength, my determination, my love for him, those were intact. Then my phone vibrated on the table. I picked it up without much haste, imagining it was my mother. But when I saw the name on the screen, my heart stopped for a moment. It was my grandmother. For a moment I froze, staring at her name as if it were a ghost from the past. Paul watched me silently, respecting the moment, but ready to intervene if I needed it. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello. The voice on the other end was hesitant, different from anything I had heard before. Alyssa, she began, her voice less imposing, more human. I heard about the work you're doing. People talk. They say you're helping many lives. I didn't know what to say. I never imagined hearing something like that from her. I just wanted to say. She hesitated, and for the first time in my life, I felt she was struggling against her own barriers. I'm sorry. For what I did. For what I said. For everything. The silence that followed was heavy, but not painful. It was the kind of silence that came with years of unspoken words finally finding space to exist. "Thank you," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "I accept your apology, but things will never be the same." "I know," she replied, and her voice was filled with something I had never heard before: acceptance. "I just wanted you to know." When the call ended, I felt something different. It wasn't anger, nor resentment. It was peace. Paul put his hand on mine and squeezed it gently. "And now?" he asked. "Now," I replied, smiling at him, "I move forward." And that's exactly what I did. And you? Have you ever had to stand up to someone important to follow your own path? What was the result? Share your story in the comments and let's talk about overcoming expectations and creating our own journeys. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories like this. See you next time.
Hi, you are on the Moving Narratives channel. Subscribe and follow our stories.